The silence in our apartment was a living thing. It had weight and texture, a low hum that vibrated just beneath the threshold of hearing. It was a silence curated by Julian, my roommate, a man who moved through the world as if noise were a personal offense. I, on the other hand, was just quiet by nature, a footnote in my own life. For 6 months, we had coexisted in this shared space, our lives running on parallel tracks that never seemed to intersect beyond a polite nod in the hallway or a shared sigh over the latest rent increase notice taped to the fridge. He was 32, I was 23. He was a carpenter, a man who worked with his hands, who smelled of cedar and turpentine and something else, something uniquely his that clung to the air in his wake. I was a freelance graphic designer, a man who worked with a mouse and a keyboard, who probably smelled of blue screen light and stale coffee. My world had shrunk to the dimensions of my laptop screen, a self-imposed exile born of shyness and a profound sense of not belonging anywhere. I had moved to the city with vague, flimsy dreams that had long since deflated, leaving me with just enough work to pay my half of the bills and an ache of loneliness so constant it had become a part of my personality. Julian was the opposite. He was a fixed point, a solid object in a world that felt increasingly liquid to me. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his worn flannel shirts, and a quiet confidence that I both envied and feared. His hair was dark and always a little too long, falling over a brow that was perpetually set in a look of calm concentration. He rarely smiled, but when he did, it was a small, private thing, a slight upward tick of one corner of his mouth that made my stomach do a slow, calamitous flip. I had developed a fascination with him that bordered on obsession. It was a quiet, harmless sort of worship conducted from the safety of my room. I learned the rhythm of his days through sound alone. The solid thud of his work boots by the door at 5:30. The clink of a beer bottle against the countertop. The low murmur of the television, usually some nature documentary about the stoic survival of Arctic wolves or deep-sea fish. The creak of his floorboards as he paced in his room. The soft sound of his breathing that sometimes carried through the thin walls when the apartment was at its most still, late at night. That sound, more than anything, was my undoing. It was proof of his existence, a steady, living metronome that soothed the frantic, anxious tempo of my own heart. I was in love with the idea of him, with the shape he occupied in my lonely life. It was a secret I kept tucked away, a flickering ember I warmed my hands on in the cold expanse of my solitude. The day the heating broke was the day the parallel lines of our lives finally bent toward each other. A bitter November cold had descended on the city, rattling the old windows of our pre-war building and seeping through the cracks in the floorboards. I woke up to see my own breath misting in the air above my face. My fingers were stiff, my nose was numb, and the radiator in my room was stone cold. I found Julian in the kitchen, staring at the thermostat with a look of grim contemplation. He was already dressed for work in jeans and a thick thermal shirt that molded to the muscles in his back and arms. He didn't seem to notice the cold. "It's dead," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to warm the air around him by a few degrees. He tapped the plastic casing of the thermostat. "Nothing. Landlord won't be able to get anyone out until tomorrow at the earliest." "Oh," was all I could manage. My teeth were chattering. He turned to look at me then, and his gaze was intense, analytical. His eyes were a dark, indeterminate color, not quite brown, not quite gray, and they seemed to see right through the flimsy defenses I had built around myself. I felt suddenly exposed, standing there in my thin pajamas, shivering like a stray. "You're freezing, Leo," it wasn't a question. "My room gets the morning sun. It's the warmest spot in the apartment. And I've got a space heater." He gestured with his chin toward the hallway. "Bring your laptop. You can work in there today." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a quiet command, delivered with an air of unshakable authority that left no room for argument. My mind raced, searching for an excuse, a polite way to decline and retreat back into my frozen cave. But the thought of spending the day in his space, surrounded by his scent, breathing his air, was a terrifying, irresistible lure. So I just nodded, a jerky, puppet-like motion. "Okay," I whispered. His room was exactly as I had imagined it, and yet entirely different. It was Spartan, meticulously neat. A queen-sized bed with a simple gray duvet, a sturdy wooden dresser, he'd likely built himself, and a single armchair in the corner. There were no posters on the walls, no personal trinkets, except for a small, framed photograph on his nightstand that was turned away from the door. The air smelled strongly of him, cedar and clean laundry and that faint, warm, musky scent of his skin. It was intoxicating. In the corner, a small electric heater was already glowing, pulsing waves of warmth into the room. "Make yourself comfortable," he said, already grabbing his jacket and keys from the dresser. "I've got to head out. There's coffee left in the pot. Help yourself." And then he was gone, the front door clicking shut behind him, leaving me alone in the sudden, profound silence of his sanctuary. I stood in the middle of the room for a long time, feeling like an intruder, a ghost haunting a space that was not my own. The warmth from the heater enveloped me, a stark contrast to the icy grip of my own anxiety. I felt a strange sense of reverence, as if I were standing in a holy place. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with his scent, and it felt like the first real breath I had taken all day. This was the catalyst. This was the shift. The cold had forced us together, and I had a terrible, thrilling feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. I spent the day huddled in the armchair, my laptop balanced precariously on my knees. The warmth from the space heater was a physical comfort, but the intimacy of the situation was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety in my chest. I was surrounded by him. His clothes were neatly folded in the open-faced closet. A well-worn leather-bound book sat on his nightstand next to the mysterious photograph. I fought the urge to look at it, feeling that it would be a violation of a trust one hadn't yet earned. Every object seemed imbued with his essence, his quiet solidity. I tried to work, but my focus was shot. My gaze kept drifting around the room, cataloging details, trying to assemble a more complete picture of the man who lived on the other side of the wall. The room was a study in controlled simplicity. The colors were muted, grays, dark blues, the warm tones of natural wood. It was a space built for rest, for quiet contemplation. It was the room of a man who needed no external validation, who was perfectly content within his own skin. It made my own room, with its chaotic stacks of books and half-finished projects, feel juvenile and cluttered by comparison. I was all frantic, nervous energy. He was a deep, still pool. Being in his room felt like a privilege, a glimpse behind a curtain he kept firmly drawn. I found myself listening for the sound of his key in the lock, my body tensing with a mixture of dread and anticipation. When he finally came home, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. The sound of his boots on the hardwood floor was a thunderclap in the quiet apartment. He appeared in the doorway of his room, filling it completely. He was silhouetted against the hallway light, a formidable presence. He didn't seem surprised to see me still there. "Still cold out there?" he asked, his voice rough from a day of disuse. I nodded, unable to speak. My throat felt tight. He moved into the room, shrugging off his heavy work jacket and dropping it onto the bed. The scent of cold air and sawdust followed him in. He ran a hand through his hair, dislodging a few tiny wood shavings that drifted down like snowflakes. I watched the gesture, mesmerized. It was so casual, so unconscious, yet so profoundly masculine. He looked tired. There were new lines of fatigue etched around his eyes. "I'll order a pizza," he said, not looking at me but at the wall, as if the decision had nothing to do with me. "My treat. For the inconvenience." "You don't have to do that," I said, my voice coming out as a squeak. He finally looked at me, and his gaze was steady, unwavering. "I know. I want to." And that was it. The conversation was over. He left the room to make the call, and I was left with the echo of his words. "I want to." It was such a simple phrase, but for me, it was a revelation. He wasn't just tolerating my presence out of a sense of duty. He was actively choosing it. The thought sent a dangerous spark of hope through me. We ate the pizza sitting on the floor of his room, our backs against the bed, the box open between us. The space heater hummed companionably. For a while, the only sounds were the tearing of crust and the soft sounds of chewing. The silence between us felt different now. It was no longer a void, but a shared space, comfortable and warm. I was intensely aware of his proximity. His knee was only inches from mine. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I focused on my pizza, studying the glistening pepperoni as if it held the secrets of the universe, terrified that if I looked at him, he would see the pathetic, desperate longing in my eyes. "So," he said, breaking the silence. "Graphic design. What do you actually do?" The question caught me off guard. No one ever asked. Most people's eyes glazed over when I tried to explain. I mumbled something about logos and web layouts, feeling my cheeks flush with heat. I was sure I sounded like an idiot. But Julian listened. He watched me with that same unnerving focus, his head tilted slightly. He didn't interrupt. When I finished my rambling, inadequate explanation, he just nodded slowly. "So you make things look right. You create order out of chaos." I blinked. I guess so. I've never thought of it like that. "That's what I do, too," he said, gesturing vaguely with a slice of pizza. "With wood. It's all just raw material. You have to see the potential in it. You have to find the grain, work with it, not against it." I was floored. In a few simple sentences, he had understood the core of my work, the part of it that I loved, and connected it to his own. He had seen me. It was a feeling so foreign, so powerful, that it almost brought tears to my eyes. We talked for over an hour. He asked me questions about my work, my family, my hometown. He didn't offer much about himself, but he was a masterful listener, drawing me out with quiet prompts and genuine curiosity. I found myself talking more than I had in months, the words spilling out of me in a rush. I was so used to being invisible, to having my thoughts and feelings remain locked inside my own head. To be the object of someone's undivided attention, especially his, was a dizzying, terrifying experience. As the evening wore on, a comfortable intimacy settled between us. The pizza was gone, the box closed and pushed to the side. Julian had leaned back, resting his head against the mattress, his long legs stretched out in front of him. I mirrored his posture, my shoulder just barely brushing against his. The point of contact was electric, a tiny starburst of heat that sent shockwaves through my entire nervous system. I didn't dare move. I barely dared to breathe. I focused on the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, visible in my peripheral vision. He didn't pull away. If anything, he seemed to relax into the contact, a soft sigh escaping his lips. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet room. I was acutely aware of every tiny detail, the worn softness of the flannel of his shirt against my arm, the faint scent of his cologne, the way the low light from the space heater cast his face in shadow and flame. This was the most prolonged physical contact I had ever had with him, and it felt monumental. It was a silent agreement, a crossing of a boundary that had, until now, been clearly defined. My internal monologue was a chaotic mess of panic and elation. He's not moving. Why isn't he moving? Does this mean something? Or am I just reading into it? Of course I'm reading into it. He probably doesn't even notice. But he has to notice. How could he not? I was analyzing the pressure of his shoulder against mine, the angle of his body, the rhythm of his breathing, searching for clues, for any sign that this meant as much to him as it did to me. It was exhausting, this constant, frantic decryption of his every move. After a long, comfortable silence, he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "You're always so quiet. I can never tell what you're thinking." The observation landed like a stone in a still pond. It's a good thing you can't, I thought. If you knew what I was thinking, you'd run for the hills. "Not much to think about," I lied, my voice thin. He turned his head to look at me, and his eyes were dark and serious in the dim light. We were so close I could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the tiny lines at the corners of his eyes. My breath hitched. "I don't believe that," he said softly. "I think there's a lot going on in there." His gaze dropped to my mouth for a fraction of a second, a flicker so quick I thought I might have imagined it. But I hadn't. The air between us crackled, suddenly thick with unspoken possibilities. My mind went completely blank. All I could think about was the proximity of his lips to mine, the sheer impossibility of it. The moment was broken by the shrill ring of his phone from the other room. He sighed, a gust of warm air that brushed against my cheek. He pushed himself to his feet with a groan, the connection between us severed. The sudden loss of his warmth was a physical ache. "Probably my sister," he said, his voice back to its normal, neutral tone as he walked out of the room. I sat there, my shoulder cold, my heart still racing. I felt like I had just been pulled back from the edge of a cliff. Had I imagined it? The look, the shift in the atmosphere? Or was it just wishful thinking, my lonely mind projecting its desires onto a simple, friendly moment? When he came back, the spell was broken. He seemed distracted, his earlier warmth replaced by a familiar, polite distance. The evening ended with a quiet good night, and I retreated to my own cold room, my mind replaying that single, charged moment over and over again, dissecting it until it lost all meaning. The next day, the heat was fixed. The apartment returned to its normal state of quiet coexistence. But something had irrevocably changed. The line between us was no longer so clearly defined. It was blurred, hazy. We started leaving our bedroom doors open. We started making enough coffee for 2 in the morning. Small, almost imperceptible shifts that signaled a new dynamic. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was filled with a low, humming tension. I became even more of an observer, my fascination with him deepening, becoming more complex. I watched the way his hands moved, the economy of his gestures. He was never clumsy, never wasted emotion. Whether he was sanding a piece of wood at the workbench he'd set up in a corner of the living room or chopping vegetables for a stew, his movements were fluid, confident, and precise. I would sit on the couch, pretending to read, and watch him through my lashes. I watched the muscles in his forearms bunch and release as he worked. I watched the way he would sometimes bite his lower lip in concentration, a gesture that made my insides clench. The casual touches became more frequent. A hand on my back as he squeezed past me in the narrow hallway, his fingers brushing mine as he handed me a mug of coffee. One evening, I was struggling to open a stubborn jar of pickles, my hands slipping on the smooth glass. He came up behind me without a word, his body pressing against my back as he reached around me. His chest was a solid wall of warmth. One of his hands covered mine on the jar, his other hand taking the base. His scent enveloped me. "Just gotta break the seal," he murmured, his voice low and close to my ear. My entire body went rigid. He gave a short, sharp twist, and the lid popped with a satisfying hiss. He didn't move away immediately. For a long, breathless moment, he just stood there, his body flush against mine, his hand still covering mine on the jar. Then he stepped back, and the moment was over. He acted as if nothing had happened, but I was trembling, my heart a trapped bird beating against my ribs. I spent hours replaying that moment in my head. Was it just a practical act of assistance? Or was it something more? A test? An invitation? My mind was a labyrinth of unanswerable questions. I was drowning in subtext, in the spaces between words, in the meaning of a lingering touch. I was falling for him, not just the idea of him, but the real, solid man who left his boots by the door and sometimes hummed off-key while he cooked. And it terrified me. The breakthrough came in the form of a ridiculously complicated piece of Swedish furniture. Julian had bought a new bookshelf, a towering monstrosity of light-colored wood, and 1,000 tiny, identical-looking screws. He unboxed it in the living room, spreading the pieces across the floor like the bones of some prehistoric beast. He stared at the wordless, cartoon instructions with a deep frown. "Need a hand?" I offered, my voice barely a whisper. I was hovering in the doorway, drawn by the sounds of his frustrated sighs. He looked up, and for the first time, he looked genuinely defeated. A rare crack in his stoic facade. "This thing was designed by a sadist," he grumbled. "Yeah, an extra pair of hands would be great." For the next 3 hours, we worked together. We knelt on the floor, side by side, our heads bent over the cryptic diagrams. It was a comedy of errors. We put shelves in upside down. We used the wrong screws. We argued good-naturedly over whether diagram C was showing a screw or a wooden dowel. I found myself laughing, a real, genuine laugh that I hadn't heard from myself in a long time. Julian laughed too, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the floorboards. In the middle of our struggle, as we were trying to lift a heavy side panel into place, our hands met. He was holding the top, I was holding the bottom. To get a better grip, I had to slide my hand up, and it closed over his. His hand was large and calloused, engulfing mine completely. Neither of us pulled away. We just stood there for a moment, holding the wooden panel, our hands joined. I looked up at him, and he was already looking at me. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were dark, intense. The playful mood vanished, replaced by that familiar, heavy tension. "Leo," he said, his voice quiet. "Yeah." I breathed. He just shook his head slightly, as if dismissing a thought, and broke eye contact. Let's get this thing upright. We finished the bookshelf in a strained silence. But the collaboration had shifted something else into place. We had worked as a team, our bodies moving in sync, our hands brushing, our knees bumping. We had shared a common goal, a common frustration, and a common victory when the monstrous thing was finally assembled and standing against the wall. We had created something together. Later that evening, we were sitting on the couch, admiring our handiwork. A comfortable silence had settled between us once more. I felt brave, buoyed by the easy camaraderie of the afternoon. That picture on your nightstand, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. The one that's turned away. I immediately regretted it. It was too personal, too intrusive. I braced myself for him to shut me down, to retreat back behind his walls. But he didn't. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the bookshelf. Then he sighed. It's my parents, he said, his voice soft. On their wedding day. They're gone now. Oh, I said, my voice thick with sympathy. I'm so sorry, Julian. It was a long time ago, he said, but there was a new note of vulnerability in his voice, a hint of old pain. My dad, he was a lot like me. Quiet. Worked with his hands. He taught me everything I know. He paused, and I could feel him wrestling with the words. He always said the most important thing you can build isn't a house or a piece of furniture. It's a life. A good, honest life. He turned to look at me then, and his eyes were filled with a profound, aching sadness. I'm 32 years old, Leo, and I haven't even started laying the foundation. It was the most he had ever revealed about himself, a raw, unguarded moment of introspection. He was showing me the cracks in his carefully constructed armor. He wasn't just the stoic, capable man I had built up in my head. He was lonely, too. He was adrift, just like me. In that moment, my heart ached for him, not with the frantic pining of a crush, but with a deep, empathetic connection. I wanted to reach out, to touch his arm, to offer some kind of comfort. But I was frozen, terrified of misreading the moment, of breaking the fragile trust he had just placed in me. So I just sat there, in the quiet, shared darkness, and held his confession like a precious, fragile thing. I had seen a glimpse of the man behind the wall, and he was more beautiful and broken and human than I could have ever imagined. The weeks that followed were a strange dance of advance and retreat. The air between us was permanently charged, thick with things unsaid. We fell into a domestic rhythm that felt dangerously like a relationship. We cooked meals together, we watched movies on the couch, we talked. The touches became more deliberate. He would let his hand rest on my shoulder for a few seconds too long. He started finding excuses to be near me, to stand just a little too close. I lived for these moments, these tiny scraps of affection that I would hoard and analyze in the privacy of my room. My internal world was in turmoil. I was swinging wildly between hope and despair. One moment, I was convinced he felt the same way, that we were on the brink of something incredible. The next, I was certain I was deluding myself, that he was just a naturally tactile, friendly person, and I was a pathetic, love-starved idiot. The uncertainty was excruciating. I wanted to scream, to just ask him what was going on, but the fear of rejection, of shattering the fragile peace we had built, was paralyzing. The tipping point came on a rainy Saturday night. We were on the couch, watching some mindless action movie. A storm was raging outside, the wind howling and the rain lashing against the windows. The power had flickered a few times, making us both jump. We were sitting closer than usual, huddled together for warmth and a sense of security against the storm. I had a blanket draped over my lap, and he had casually draped his arm over the back of the couch behind me. His fingers were just inches from my neck. I wasn't watching the movie. I was watching him. He was staring at the screen, his jaw set, his expression intent. The flickering light from the television danced across his face, highlighting the sharp planes of his cheekbones and the dark stubble on his jaw. He was beautiful. The thought was so clear, so overwhelming, that it stole the air from my lungs. He must have felt my gaze, because he turned his head slowly to look at me. The sound of explosions and gunfire from the movie faded into the background. The only sounds were the storm outside and the frantic beating of my own heart. His eyes searched mine, and I felt stripped bare, all my secrets, all my yearning, laid out for him to see. His gaze was heavy, questioning. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The question was there, hanging in the air between us. What is this? What are we doing? Slowly, deliberately, he moved his hand from the back of the couch. My heart leaped into my throat. I thought he was going to touch me. I wanted him to touch me more than I had ever wanted anything in my life. His fingers brushed against the back of my neck, a feather-light touch that sent a shiver down my spine. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but it was enough. It was a spark in a room full of gasoline. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned and turned his attention back to the screen. But the air had changed. The tension was a physical thing, a solid wall between us. We sat there for the rest of the movie in a thick, unbearable silence, the space between us humming with unspoken energy. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was going to explode. When the credits rolled, I stood up too quickly, my legs unsteady. I'm going to bed, I mumbled, not looking at him. I needed to escape, to be alone with the chaotic symphony in my head. Leo, he said, his voice quiet but firm. It stopped me in my tracks. I turned around slowly. He was still sitting on the couch, watching me with that intense, unreadable expression. Good night, he said. But it sounded like a question. It sounded like a dismissal. It sounded like a plea. I fled to my room, my heart pounding. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The feel of his fingers on my neck was a phantom touch that I could still feel, a brand that had seared itself into my skin. The silence from the living room was deafening. I didn't know how much more of this I could take. The not knowing was going to tear me apart. I must have been lying there for half an hour, caught in a spiral of overthinking and anxiety, when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up the dark room. It was a text from Julian. My hands were trembling as I picked it up. My thumb hovered over the notification, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was terrified of what it might say. An apology? A clarification that he was just being friendly? I finally summoned the courage to open it. 3 words. 3 simple words that changed everything. Come to my room. The world stopped. The air left my lungs in a rush. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a summons. My mind went blissfully, terrifyingly blank. There was no more room for analysis, for overthinking. There was only the pull, the undeniable gravity of him on the other side of the wall. I am moving. My body is acting on its own accord, a puppet pulled by an invisible string. My feet are bare on the cold hardwood floor. Each step is a lifetime. The hallway seems to stretch on for miles. His door is slightly ajar, a sliver of warm light cutting through the darkness. I push the door open. He is standing in the middle of the room, waiting for me. He hasn't changed out of his jeans and t-shirt. The only light comes from the small lamp on his nightstand, casting long shadows on the walls. His face is half in shadow, his expression impossible to read, but his eyes are burning with an intensity that pins me to the spot. The air is thick, heavy, vibrating with all the tension we have built over the past weeks. He doesn't speak. He just watches me, his gaze traveling over me from head to toe, as if he's seeing me for the first time. I feel my heart pounding in my throat, a wild, frantic rhythm. I don't know what to do, what to say. I just stand there, in the doorway, a willing captive. He takes a step toward me, then another. He moves with a slow, deliberate grace, like a predator closing in on its prey. He doesn't stop until he is standing directly in front of me, so close I can feel the heat coming off his body in waves. He raises a hand, and I flinch, expecting. I don't know what I'm expecting, but his touch is gentle. He cups my jaw, his thumb stroking softly over my cheek. His hand is so warm, so steady. It's the anchor I've been searching for. I can't do this anymore, Leo, he whispers, his voice rough, thick with emotion. This pretending, this dancing around each other. My breath catches in my throat. I can only stare at him, my eyes wide. Every day, he continues, his voice dropping even lower, I watch you. I watch you hide in your room. I watch you look at me when you think I'm not looking. And I wonder if you feel even a fraction of what I feel. His words are a balm, a confession that I had only dreamed of hearing. A wave of relief, so profound it makes my knees weak, washes over me. Tell me to stop, he says, his eyes searching mine, dark and desperate. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me to leave you alone, and I will. But if you don't say anything, I can't speak. I can't move. All I can do is look at him, and I know that my eyes are giving him the answer he's looking for. I know he can see the years of loneliness, the months of quiet yearning, the lifetime of waiting for this single, impossible moment. A slow smile spreads across his face. It's not the small, private smile I'm used to. This one is different. It's triumphant. It's predatory. And it's the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. In one swift, fluid motion, he closes the remaining space between us. He tangles his free hand in the hair at the nape of my neck, tilting my head back. And then he shoves me. It's not a violent push, but it's firm, undeniable. My back hits the door, the wood hard against my shoulder blades. He presses his body against mine, caging me in. Then, with a strength that takes my breath away, he turns me, his hands on my shoulders, and propels me toward the bed. I stumble forward, my legs clumsy, my mind reeling. I fall onto the mattress, the soft duvet cushioning my landing. Before I can even process what is happening, he is there, climbing onto the bed, his knees on either side of my hips. He crawls over me, his movements deliberate, powerful. He settles his weight on top of me, his forearms bracketing my head, his body a heavy, solid presence that pins me to the bed. I am trapped, and I have never felt more free in my entire life. He lowers his head until his face is just inches from mine. His breath is warm on my skin. His eyes are dark, bottomless pools, and I am drowning in them. The world has shrunk to this single point, to the space between his body and mine. The scent of him, cedar and soap and warm skin, is all-consuming. "Leo," he breathes, his voice a gravelly whisper. And then he kisses me. It is not a gentle kiss. It is not tentative. It is a kiss of desperation, of hunger, of pent-up frustration and months of unspoken longing. It is a kiss that claims, that possesses. His lips are firm, demanding, moving against mine with a certainty that leaves no room for doubt. He tastes of coffee and something else, something wild and uniquely Julian. A groan escapes my throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated surrender. My hands, which had been lying uselessly at my sides, come up to fist in the fabric of his t-shirt, pulling him closer, trying to erase what little space is left between us. He deepens the kiss, his tongue tracing the seam of my lips, a silent question that I answer by parting them for him. He explores my mouth with a slow, thorough intensity that makes my head spin. It is an invasion, a conquest, and I am a willing participant. This is not the gentle, hesitant kiss I had sometimes imagined in my lonely fantasies. This is real. This is raw. This is a dam breaking, a floodgate opening, a release of all the tension that has been humming between us for months. When he finally breaks the kiss, we are both breathless, panting. He rests his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. His weight on me is a comfort, a grounding force in a world that has just been tilted off its axis. I can feel the frantic beat of his heart against my chest, a perfect match for my own. "I've wanted to do that," he says, his voice ragged, "since the day you moved in." The confession hangs in the air between us, a beautiful, impossible truth. I feel a laugh bubble up from my chest, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy and relief. "Me too," I whisper, my voice trembling. He pulls back just enough to look at me, a real smile, wide and genuine, lighting up his entire face. It transforms him, erases the lines of fatigue and worry, making him look younger, freer. He lowers his head and kisses me again, and this time it's different. It's slow, it's tender. It's a kiss of discovery, of promise. It's a kiss that says, this is not the end. This is the beginning. He laces his fingers with mine, our hands joined on the pillow next to my head. It is a simple gesture, but it feels like a vow. It feels like coming home. I woke to the pale, gray light of dawn filtering through the window. For a moment, I was disoriented, the unfamiliar ceiling above me a stark white canvas. Then the memories of the night before came rushing back in a warm, dizzying flood. The kiss, his confession, the weight of his body on mine. I turned my head, and the other side of the bed was empty. The sheets were cool. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the warm haze of my memory. He was gone. A wave of dread washed over me. Had I dreamed it all? Was it just a cruel, elaborate fantasy spun from my own desperate loneliness? Or worse, did he regret it? Was he, at this very moment, in his own room, regretting his loss of control, wishing he could take it all back. The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I sat up, my heart pounding a frantic, anxious rhythm against my ribs. The apartment was silent. Too silent. I slipped out of his bed, my bare feet cold on the wooden floor. His room was just as I had left it, neat and orderly, giving no clue to the emotional cataclysm that had occurred within its walls. I crept to the door, my stomach twisting into a tight, painful knot. I peered into the hallway. My own bedroom door was closed. The living room was empty. The fear was a living thing inside me now, a cold, slithering serpent coiling in my gut. This is what I got for letting my guard down, for daring to hope. I had shattered the comfortable, safe distance between us, and now I was going to lose him completely. He would move out. He would find another roommate, one who wasn't so pathetic, so needy. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the doorframe, my eyes squeezed shut, bracing myself for the inevitable, awkward conversation that would end our fragile connection for good. I was an idiot, a complete and utter idiot. Then I smelled it, the rich, dark scent of coffee. I followed the smell to the kitchen, my steps hesitant, my whole body tense. He was there, his back to me, standing in front of the stove. He was wearing a fresh t-shirt and a pair of worn gray sweatpants that hung low on his hips. He was just making coffee. The sheer domesticity of the scene was so at odds with the frantic drama playing out in my head that I just stood there, frozen in the doorway, watching him. He must have sensed my presence, because he turned around. He had 2 mugs in his hands. He looked at me, and his expression was calm, his eyes soft. There was no regret there, no panic, just a quiet, steady warmth that seemed to reach across the room and wrap around me. "Morning," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. He held out one of the mugs to me. I took it from him, my fingers brushing against his. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into my cold hands. I couldn't speak. I just looked at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt, any hint of the morning after awkwardness I had been so sure I would find. There was none. He leaned back against the counter, taking a sip from his own mug, his eyes never leaving mine. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't the tense, charged silence of the night before. It was a comfortable, easy silence. A silence that didn't need to be filled. "I didn't regret it," he said softly, as if reading my mind. "Did you?" The question was so direct, so honest, that it cut through all my anxiety. I shook my head, a small, jerky motion. "No," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "No, not at all." A small smile touched his lips. He reached out and tucked a stray piece of my sleep-mussed hair behind my ear. His fingers were warm against my skin, his touch deliberate, reassuring. It was a simple, grounding gesture that said more than words ever could. It said, "This is real. We are real." "Good," he said. In that moment, all my fear, all my insecurity, just dissolved. It was replaced by a quiet, profound sense of peace. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to push me away. He was here. He was solid. He was real. And he was looking at me like I was the only person in the world. My own internal battle, the fear that I was unworthy of this kind of attention, this kind of affection, seemed to shrink in the face of his quiet confidence. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that I deserved this, that I deserved him. It was a terrifying, exhilarating thought. I had to make a choice: retreat back into my safe, lonely shell, or trust this man, this feeling, this incredible, fragile new beginning. We stood there in the quiet kitchen, the morning light streaming in through the window, just drinking our coffee and looking at each other. It was a new kind of observation. I was no longer trying to decipher him, to decode his every micro-expression. I was just seeing him, and he was seeing me. Later that day, we found ourselves back on the couch. The world outside was waking up, the sounds of traffic and city life filtering in. But inside our apartment, it was quiet, peaceful. It felt like our own private world. I was nervous, my old anxieties trying to creep back in. Now what? What were we? What did this all mean? As if sensing my internal turmoil, Julian turned to me. He took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, a comfortable, natural fit. "I don't know what this is yet," he said, his voice low and serious. "I'm not good at this. At talking about feelings," he looked down at our joined hands. "But I want to figure it out. With you." His words were simple, direct, and completely honest. There were no grand declarations of love, no flowery promises. It was better than that. It was a statement of intent. It was a conscious choice. He was choosing me. And now, it was my turn to choose. I squeezed his hand. "Me too," I said, and my voice was steady. For the first time, I felt like an active participant in my own life, not just a passive observer. I wasn't being swept along by events. I was making a decision. I was choosing him, choosing us. A look of relief washed over his face, so profound it was almost painful to watch. He brought my hand to his lips and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my knuckles. The gesture was so tender, so full of a reverence I never thought would be directed at me, that it made my heart ache with a sweet, unfamiliar joy. We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. We just sat there, on the couch, our hands intertwined, our shoulders pressed together. The sun had finally broken through the clouds, and a beam of warm, golden light slanted across the living room floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I leaned my head against his shoulder, and his arm came around me, pulling me in close. His body was a solid, comforting weight against mine. I closed my eyes, breathing in his familiar scent, cedar and coffee and home. For years, I had felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of my own life, invisible to the world. I had built walls around my heart so high and so thick that I had forgotten what it felt like to be touched, to be seen. But Julian had seen me. He had seen the quiet, lonely boy hiding behind the silence, and he hadn't run away. He had walked right through my walls as if they were made of mist. Lying there, tucked safely against his side, listening to the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart, a profound sense of peace settled over me. The constant, anxious hum in my mind had finally gone quiet. The gnawing ache of loneliness that had been my constant companion for as long as I could remember was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady warmth that spread through my entire body. I wasn't just in an apartment anymore. I was in a home. My frantic, solitary search was over. I had been found. I had finally come home.